Welcome to the Cove Podcast, your stop for PME on the go.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Cove Podcast. I'm your regular host, Captain Todd Lemper. And I'm again joined, it's been some time since we did the last episode, sir, but I'm again joined by Lieutenant Colonel Steve Young, who's our somewhat historian going through the Pacific. So I think the last episode we did together, sir, was the bombing of Darwin, and subsequently had Major Guy Warnock go through and talk about Timor in detail, but more so the Independent Commando Company in Dili, defending the Dili aerodrome, and we talked about that. So now we're coming, the natural, I think last time you said this has been incredibly pessimistic and we need to get into something optimistic. You chose Milne Bay, and that's what we're going to talk to today. So welcome back, sir.
Thanks very much, Todd.
I think Milne Bay is we've got a lot to cover. We'll see how we go about covering all the stuff, but Milne Bay is somewhat different to there are some lessons that we can take out, and we're going to do that as we go through the episode. But I think the first thing to talk about, and we spoke about how to phrase it, but I think we talk about the character of Milne Bay and the fighting that occurred in the region. And I'll start with a quote. Milne Bay was a peculiar battle, fought largely in the dead of the night, in unspeakable conditions, by men exhausted and often sick, with many on both sides new to combat. It was a battle of 1,000 crazy skirmishers fought in pitch black, illuminated only by muzzle flashes, flares, or the blinding spotlights of the Japanese tanks that pierced the jungle, defying the best efforts of the Australian riflemen to shoot them out. It was fought at frighteningly close quarters in blind and savage groupings where the bayonets were used as frequently as the rifle. The voices of the enemy could easily be heard, laughing, shouting, and even taunting, sometimes in perfect English. As the battle went on, the Australian daily passwords were selected from words beginning with L. Life, Lewis, lonely, little, to confound the Japanese attempts to mimic them. I suppose that quote's from one of the sources that we're going to use today, an amazing book called The Turning Point by Michael Veitch. It's completely distinct from, I suppose there are some similarities between other battles, but I suppose if we zoom out a touch, what's happening to go back to the battle in the Pacific, sir?
Yeah, thanks, Todd. Before I do that, I just want to mention the other two sources that we've used. The first one is the official histories, Kokoda to Wow. That volume's by Dudley McCarthy, freely available online from the Australian War Memorial. And the other one is actually one of the Australian campaign series on the Battle of Milne Bay by Nicholas Anderson. That is a fantastic little read, which is packed full of detail and also insight. Right, strategic situation then. So I think the first where we'll pick this up is actually the Battle of the Coral Sea. So we're talking early May 1942, and the Japanese have decided that they need to continue their advances through the Pacific after their first waves of advances were so successful through that Japanese thrust that we mentioned previously. So if we think back to the Kido Butai, those 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, 2 of them head south to support an amphibious invasion of Port Moresby. Now that results in the Battle of the Coral Sea when the Americans send 2 of their aircraft carriers, the Lexington and the Yorktown, to intercept them, and it ends up being the first sea battle where the adversary ships don't actually see each other, it's aircraft only. The result of that, though, is that the amphibious invasion fleet that was heading through the Solomon Sea and to Port Moresby ends up retreating to Rabaul. So a pretty pivotal moment there and a pivotal check. So the US and Australia then decide that in order to prevent that ever happening again, they need a way of projecting air power out into the Solomon Sea, and they also need a way of launching air raids on Rabaul without having to fly from Port Moresby over the Owen Stanley Ranges. So that leaves you with only a few places, and one of them is an area called Milne Bay. So we might just do a quick ground brief on Milne Bay.
Yep.
Can you just talk us through the pubs of Milne Bay?
No, I can't do that. I did that in Darwin. I'm definitely familiar with that, but I
haven't been there. All right, well, look, I'll take this ground brief. Okay, so look, if you think of the map, Papua New Guinea, the island goes in its eastern part down into a point. Now, if you zoom in on that point, you will see that there is a U-shaped bay. If you turn to U on its side, sort of to the east, you get this U shape. Now, the northern part of that bay is dominated by jungles and the Stirling mountain range. And then you can sort of move back in the sort of curve of the U to a point called Gilly Gilly. It's a massive coconut plantation, palm plantation, and they're making copra there before the war, which is coconut husks and coconut meat that is then used in the palm oil industry. The thing about it is when they're trying to select a position is that this is the only place that Australians know where the ground isn't too boggy to be able to put airfields down.
And we talk about like selecting locations to sort of establish based on airfields in a number of different of the episodes we talked about, but this one is much the same. It's exactly the same.
Yeah, 100%. It's certainly not ideal, and there are a whole lot of challenges that come with the terrain. Not least of which is the fact that it rains there frequently. So we're not talking about bitumen roads here. We're talking about sort of a jungle track that goes along the coast of the area. Okay, so Australians put the first troops ashore there on the 25th of June, 1942, and US engineers arrive on the 29th of June to start building the airfields, and they get started straight away. Now, why US engineers? It's because Australia doesn't have the capability to build airfields in an expeditionary manner at this point of time. But the thing is that none of this is happening in a vacuum. So just a couple of other things I want to highlight that are going on around these landings at the end of June. So the first one is there's some key movements and also battles. So the Japanese land on Tulagi on the 3rd of May, and then on the 8th of June they land on Guadalcanal and start building an airfield in order to do exactly what the Australians are trying to do, project air power through the Solomon Islands archipelago. They also decide that they still need to take Port Moresby, but obviously an amphibious invasion didn't work last time, so instead they land on the north shore of Papua New Guinea at Bunagona and start marching across the Owen Stanley Ranges in a movement that results in the Kokoda campaign. Then at the beginning of June, the old Kido Butai, those aircraft carriers, there's 4 of the 6 of them sunk at the Battle of Midway. Now that really is a pivotal moment because it changes the way that the Japanese Navy sees their potential for offensive action, and they become a little more timid through that next period, noting the efficacy of US air power that's just been demonstrated.
So as we're coming to the end of that, not the end, but a turning point to use the author's title of the book in that Japanese thrust, the episodes that we've already spoken about now.
Yeah, exactly. It's there's a lot going on, and of course I think linking back to that the last point about Timor is that people like Sparrow Force trying to tie up Japanese troops on islands so that they can't be used for offensive action in other places.
Yeah, those two, particularly the 2 independent commando companies in East Timor, up in the hills off Dili, sort of mounting that somewhat successful guerrilla campaign, because we're talking about them bogging down. The estimation is 30,000 Japanese troops were committed to the island of Timor, and this small force, being the 2 independent commando companies, are absolutely like doing their best to tie up resources in the Japanese so that they couldn't be otherwise committed somewhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. It's part of that integrated campaigning piece when things aren't happening in a vacuum in a theatre. Okay, so let's zoom in on Milne Bay then and what's happening in Milne Bay. So the first formation that Australia puts on the ground is the 7th Brigade. It is a militia brigade. The commander is a guy called Field, Brigadier Field. He is not a veteran of the First World War. He was actually too young, but he's the kind of guy who's written some articles for the Cove, actually. Not that he did write articles for the Cove. Cove didn't exist, of course, but he writes about the future of warfare and how to combine modern weaponry to produce effects on the ground throughout the 1930s. So he sort of considers himself as a thinker. There's some really interesting contrasts with how Field approaches his task to say how Scanlon approached his task in Rabaul. Now, the first thing is that Field combines a desire for camouflage with a very aggressive patrolling mindset. And so if we think back to Rabaul, I still find it stunning that the Australians didn't understand fully the battle space that they were in just because they hadn't been conducting patrolling throughout the the previous time.
So no pre-planned withdrawal routes, no caching of food in stores, and that was spoken about as being like cowardice to basically to his soldiers and stuff, and then a number of different things, not getting out and seeing the lay of land. Whereas we're talking about 7th Brigade now, getting out into like day-long patrols, much the same as Major Warnock talking about his time in Interfet, but subsequently the Timor. We're getting out and getting the lay of the land, and then pre-planning withdrawal routes is one of the main efforts of the Brigadier Field. And I imagine that was their caching and stuff as well.
Yeah, and it's also he's sending out platoon patrols up to the far north coast, so through the Stirling Mountains, and trying to understand all of the avenues of approach that an adversary might be able to employ. There's something else that he does, which I think is that there are real lessons there, and that is about his treatment of the local population there. Now, the population, there are some Australian settlers running those coconut plantations, but the predominant population is Papua New Guineans. And he is at great pains to make sure that his soldiers treat them with the utmost respect. They are not to take any of their produce. If they do, they are to buy it. And he just has a way of keeping the local population on side. And the payoff for that is that he then has a whole lot of local scouts that talk to him about all of the different avenues of approach and send them out. Field comes out of this really very, very well. And the camouflaging is highly successful as well. And they know their battle space as a result of this. Now, so that's a brigade there. So again, without being unkind to Scanlon, already there is, about 3 times the force that was at Rabaul sitting at Milne Bay. And
it doesn't stop there. We're going to talk about another brigade coming in over the top. But basically, we're going from, in the past episodes, a battalion into an island, whichever of the 3 you pick, whereas now we're talking about an entire brigade, like moving into Milne Bay with US airfield engineers starting to clear trees and lay aircraft matting.
Yeah, correct. And and of course then... once the first airfield is open, the Kitty Hawks start arriving, the P-40s, which are an aircraft that is competitive against the Japanese Zero, which is important. Okay, the 7th Brigade is then reinforced with another brigade, which is the 18th Brigade. Now, this is an AIF brigade. This is an Australian Imperial Force Brigade, and it has fought at Tobruk and through North Africa, and then come back to Australia and then been pushed up into Milne Bay. It's commanded by a guy called George Wootton. Now, George Wootton is a pretty interesting sort of character. He is politically very right-wing and becomes an activist in that way. But he's 175 centimetres tall and he's 127 kilograms.
Yeah.
He's a big guy. But he's also, and this is where I want to start talking about the importance of personal relationships. He's an original Duntroon graduate. And by original Duntroon graduate, I mean he got to the college in 1911 and he graduated early to join the First World War, along with basically everybody who was at RMC at the time. He fights at Gallipoli. And he then goes on to have a storied career, being mentioned in dispatches 4 times and being awarded as a Distinguished Service Order through the First World War. And he has also served at Tobruk. So he's a veteran commander and an impressive guy. Now, of course, then you've got in location, this is the middle of August now, you've got 2 brigadiers and then a group captain commanding the Air Force element there.
I think it's important we go through that RAF element, which is, so there's 2 squadrons, 75 and 76 Squadron. Now, we spoke about 75 Squadron in our Bombing of Darwin episode. They do the demonstration for Bombing of Darwin in Darwin each year, but they're currently based at Tyndall and they fly the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. But at the time, they were flying Kitty Hawks. So it's a long history in that. And then 76 Squadron is the Operational Convergence Squadron. They still fly a Hawk aircraft, but it's the jet conversion for pilots and Wizzos now. But basically, those 2 squadrons still exist, but they are absolutely in and committed, and have this group captain as the lead for both of those squadrons flying Kitty Hawks. Somewhat not a lot of experience flying formation, and the conditions are absolutely horrendous, but we're going to talk about that, I think, in great detail when we get into the battle itself.
Yeah, we will. And look, really briefly, the aircraft they're operating, there's Kitty Hawks and also Hudson bombers. Anybody who's been through Canberra Airport, if you look at the Virgin Terminal side, you'll see a Hudson bomber sitting right there. So that's the aircraft they're using. A Kitty Hawk is armed with 650 caliber machine guns, so a reasonable amount of firepower when you start to talk about strafing runs and the like. Okay, so because you've got this joint force there, in fact, it's a joint combined force because you've got the US engineers and some anti-aircraft gunners from the US as well, the Australians put a 2-star over the top of it. Now, this isn't a 2-star div commander because the two brigades are from different divisions, but this is a man called Major General Cyril Clowes, and he's placed in command on the 22nd of August. So we've been there for nearly 2 months at this stage, building the airfields. Now, Clowes' bio is also interesting. He's a Duntroon graduate as well, and he's a classmate of Wootton. He also landed at Gallipoli on Anzac Day and fought through the Western Front, earning both a military cross, so second only to the Victoria Cross for gallantry, and was awarded a Distinguished Service Order for his actions at Villers-Bretonneux. He was also a veteran of the Greek campaign from the previous year. So, again, a pretty impressive character. But, Wootton and he have known each other from 1911 as Duntroon classmates. That's a long time.
And I think that argument that you need to remember, you work with people at RMC, they remember what you. Yeah, I think it's an important point. We'll come back to.
So I can remember Todd saying to you and a few other people, don't be dickheads to your peers because you never know exactly how they're going to influence your future career.
Yeah,
and this
epitomises it.
It gets better. We'll get to the other links that exist in this battle a little later. But yeah, don't be dickheads, people. Okay, now the Japanese don't discover, thanks to Field's camouflage, they don't discover that there is anything going on at Milne Bay until the 3rd of August. A routine recon flight actually sees some Kitty Hawks landing and comes in for a closer look and then goes, "Ooh, there's something here." So on the 4th of August, the first of the Japanese air attacks begins, and it's with Zeros, but it's not a one-way affair. This isn't Rabaul. There are Australians that have the capacity to defend this airfield, and they do so very successfully from the air. But the Japanese start planning immediately to recapture Milne Bay and not allow that airfield to exist. And they conceive of it as a joint operation with both Japanese Navy land troops and also Imperial Japanese Army troops involved, as well as aircraft flying out of Rabaul and surface ships coming, again, based at Rabaul. The last piece is they decide that they will have a force coming from Bunagona, about 500 strong, landing north of the bay, north of the Stirling Mountains, to then come south through those tracks that we spoke about before that Field had reconnoitred already. Then for the Japanese, on the 7th of August, something happens that changes their calculus massively, and that is that the US 1st Marine Division lands at Guadalcanal. And all of a sudden, what was looking like a force that would be maybe 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 strong that the Japanese could land, the Imperial Japanese Army component of that force got taken away in order to combat the US landings on Guadalcanal. So now, all of a sudden, you've just got the Japanese Special Naval land forces that will conduct this operation alone. So they come up with a plan. They call it the Rabi plan. Rabi is a small village on the north coast of the of Milne Bay, and essentially you've got those 500 men coming from Bunagona. They're known as the Sasebo force, and then you've also got the Kure No. 5 force coming with 1,200 men and 2 Hargo tanks coming from Rabaul, and they're going straight into the mouth of Milne Bay to land. And the tanks are the Japanese way of recognising that they need more combat power in there, although their reconnaissance hasn't identified how large the Australian force is there due to that camouflage. The Allied forces on the ground, then on essentially the eve of battle, if you like, you've got the 7th and 18th Brigade. They number about 7,500. The RAAF force is about 660, with ground crew and also pilots. And you also have the US engineers and anti-aircraft gunners with 1,340.
Just before we get to the battle, so you talked about the force composition there. So the US airfield engineers are starting to use machinery and to clear these large plantations to be able to lay aircraft matting, and trying to conceal the turnout where the aircraft will be parked on the edge of the runway and the like. But so you talked about two different brigades there, the 7th and the 18th. How were they? What was the intent for them? Because I think they were used differently, right? What was the plan for both of those brigades?
Yeah, so the 7th is a militia formation and the 18th is an AIF formation. And essentially, Clowes saw it that the 18th would be better suited to offensive action and, if you like, would be his commander's reserve. And the 7th and the militia were probably the people that he would use to fully understand what it was that the Japanese had landed. The 7th has been there for significantly longer than the 18th as well. That's the other point to note, that one, they know the terrain better, but two, they're also suffering more non-battle casualties due to the malaria that's throughout the area.
So more pragmatic, because you're talking about the 18th Brigade having a significant amount of experience in other theatres and campaigns in the world, and then coming and being used in reserve. But you're saying that it was more of a pragmatic approach to that in terms of there was non-battle casualties, and the 7th Brigade knew the lay of the land because they were there first and stuff.
Yeah, so I think we'll get to some of this, but Clowes cops some flack for being. His critics would say that he wasn't aggressive enough. I would say that his caution was pretty well founded, given that his critical mission was to hold those airfields and to maintain that. And he never would have a complete understanding of the size of the Japanese force that would be coming for him. So his decision to keep a significant portion of his force in reserve to people a long way away may look timid, but actually I think that caution was probably well founded, given that the critical part of his mission was not relinquishing those airfields. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, yeah. So if we then turn, that's the Allied composition on the ground. You talked about numbers and who was there to fight the fight. If we then, all right, let's get into the battle and the thick stuff. How does the Japanese landing go?
Okay, so the Japanese force leaves Buna. That's the 500 men of the Sasebo force. They leave on the 24th of August, and they're in 7 Daihatsu barges. They're like think of sort of like a longer Higgins boat. The Higgins boats are the ones from like Saving Private Ryan. They're like little barges, landing craft sort of thing.
People really appreciate your pop culture references to movies and stuff as well. Yeah.
Oh yeah, right. I'm getting good feedback on that. Great. But they're relatively flimsy. They're made of wood, and while they're relatively quick, they don't have the facilities to cook on board and the like. So they're an interesting little craft. So 7 of them start puttering down the Papua New Guinean coast, but they're spotted by an Australian coast watcher, and the P-40s back in Milne Bay start taking off to try to find this force, and they do find them. In fact, they find them at probably the worst possible time for the Sasebo force, because they've pulled into a small bay and are unloading in order to rest and cook for the night. And the Kitty Hawks start coming in against these little wooden boats with 650 caliber machine guns each. There's no air cover for the Japanese, and literally all 7 barges are destroyed and the unit's destroyed. Now, the Sasebo force had been like a late addition to the Japanese plan, and so the commanders were in like a massive hurry to get this done. And that also meant that they made mistakes in terms of what they took. They didn't take, for instance, a radio transmitter. Now that sounds crazy to us, but they had a receiver so they could hear what was going on.
Could not send messages.
Couldn't send messages.
Yeah.
You also have to wonder, how did they think they were going to coordinate their assault? But perhaps that gets back to Japanese overconfidence at the time. But the result of this, small battle is that the Sasebo force ceases to exist as a formation that the Australians need to worry about at all, and it's a pretty large victory. The main force of the Japanese departs Rabaul with 1,200 people in 2 merchant ships. They've got 2 light cruisers, 3 destroyers and 2 sort of sub-chasers. So a small surface fleet heading in to Milne Bay during the night, essentially. But the thing is that it's such a light force that because the Allied forces are fully engaged around Guadalcanal at the time. So they actually don't have much of a surface threat against them because of the other stuff that's going on. So that integrated campaigning piece, I guess, works two ways, and it works in favour of the Japanese in this instance. And indeed, what you see is that the Japanese have, throughout the Battle of Milne Bay, they have surface naval supremacy, but they also fear the Allied air forces, particularly after the Battle of Midway, where they've just lost 4 aircraft carriers. They do not want to be caught in daylight in and around Milne Bay and the Solomon Sea. And so that means that the RAAF aircraft have air supremacy throughout the day, pretty much throughout the battle. There's an interesting C2 relationship, particularly with the Americans, where Americans, no country likes to put their people under the direct command of people. So Clowes has this reserve power almost, that in the event of an imminent battle, he can exert command over the American forces. But if it's not imminent, then they've got their own mission. They do what they like. So he asserts control, citing that there is an imminent attack on the afternoon of the 25th of August. So that's the first time that he sort of says, "Yep, I'm in control of everything in Milne Bay," which I think is an interesting lesson for us to think about our own command relationships with close allies. Okay, so the Japanese land, and where they land is on the north coast of the bay, and they land there with their force of 1,200 men and 2 Hargo tanks. There follows quite a confused sort of encounter battle with one of the militia battalions, the 61st Battalion, and again you've got a mix of people within the 61st Battalion. Some of them are former First World War veterans, and some of them are more traditional sort of militia forces. The Hargo tanks really do cause a massive concern for the Australians, and they don't have an effective way of dealing with them as far down the coast as what this is. They do have some Boys anti-tank rifles, which they're the 1940s equivalent of an anti-materiel rifle. Large, cumbersome, you might break your collarbone when you fire it, but it will penetrate a tank like the Hargo tank. But the 61st Battalion, and indeed the battalion after them, don't have them on them. The 61st Battalion fight a fighting withdrawal throughout those early phases, and there's one person in particular that I want to call out here, and that's a guy called Lieutenant Robinson. He's in the forward element. He has 14 of his men with him conducting this fighting withdrawal. Robinson is one of the better shots in the battalion, and in the pre-dawn, he sees an opportunity where the Japanese commander of one of the Hargo tanks, he's about to cross a creek line across a small wooden bridge. And in order to not go off the sides of the tank, the commander exposes himself, gets out of his hatch, and he's making sure that the tank doesn't go off the edge. Now, Robinson takes that chance and actually shoots and kills the commander. And as a result of that, the tank veers off that little wooden bridge and gets bogged in the creek, and it needs to be then recovered. And the other thing that starts happening after that is that, so this is now in the morning, the Kitty Hawks from the Milne Bay airfields, they start to strafe the Japanese bridgehead, and they strafe it throughout the day. So just think about what it would be like to try to run a logistic node, getting stores and equipment off the beach, if every 30 minutes to 2 hours, you're copying, maybe 4 aircraft coming in with 650 caliber machine guns, firing down at you. It's just a very, very disruptive thing to then try to deal with. So late then on the 26th of August, so that's basically that first day with the Japanese sort of trying to probe forward. They're trying to recover a tank to then be able to launch an assault. The 61st Battalion gets told that they are to attempt an assault on the Japanese bridgehead. the Japanese beachhead there. And it's a fairly confused battle, and not much is actually gained from that fight, and they end up needing to withdraw in some disarray. Although it's not, I think you could characterise it as a withdrawal, not a retreat.
With Robinson, you talked about him engaging the tank commander and stuff, but I think that it's a pivotal moment because we're talking about the starting of the battle, and them anticipating the Japanese arriving, finally hearing boat motors and some different stuff, and then Robinson setting up an ambush basically to start sort of moving through what he thinks is the first part of the battle. I'm just going to read a part from the turning point. Robinson had chosen his position well under a spur of the plunging Stirling Range where it runs down to meet the government track. On the spur itself, he had placed a man with a Bren light machine gun. Further along the track, his name was Private Whitten, stood as the forward sentry. He was certain the Japanese would soon arrive at this position and was determined, if even for a short time, to control it. In silence, the men kept their eyes on the track through the jungle and the mangroves, listening to the sounds of the barges and the distance firings, which soon faded. Many were aware that the Delta Company comrades were somewhat on the far side of the Japanese landing area and that they too could be coming this way. The appalling possibility of firing into the dark and hitting one's own was real. At about 1 a.m, Private Whitten heard rustling and footsteps as four shadowy figures approached along the track. Instead of withdrawing to report to Robinson, the inexperienced militiaman raised his rifle and issued a verbal challenge, "Halt, who goes there?" The challenge received no answer, but only a short pause followed by a series of gunshots from advancing Japanese scouts. Whitten dropped down dead in the mud. Behind him, the remainder of Robinson's platoon opened fire, killing the 4 Japanese. Robinson, cursing, dragged Whitten's body into the bush and ordered his men to deploy themselves on both sides of the track for an ambush. The 26-year-old bank clerk from Brisbane became the first Australian to die in the fight for Milne Bay. 20 minutes later, many more, feet and voices were heard approaching. Even now, their identity caused hesitation, and Robinson, loath to risk firing at his own men, even committed the sin of calling out to them. It seemed to go unheard. As 100 or so Japanese appeared on the track, they pulled up around the 4 dead Marines at their feet, seemingly unconcerned that the men who had shot them could still be in the area. Now, Robinson did not hesitate, and at his shout of fire, the Bren gun on the spur line opened up at the centre of the mass of gathered bodies. Some Japanese fell, but the rest scattered and began their standard outflanking manoeuvre. Major Warnock spoke about this, pushing deep into the forest and working their way around to the enemy position, which had proved so devastating to Commonwealth forces in Malaya. Some took off towards the north mountain side of the government track, while other Marines entered the water. Holding their rifles above their head, they waited around to outflank Robinson's men from the south. The Japanese on the northern side soon came under fire from the man Robinson had put behind the Bren gun, Private Latour, but eventually overwhelmed him. He was never seen again. Robinson saw the trap being set and withdrew 200 yards back up the track to another defensive position, but in the confusion his small party became fragmented. One group of 3 men vanished, while Sergeant Ridley and Private Fraser became surrounded. Ridley had taken a bullet through his thigh, and Fraser was also slightly wounded. The 2 men crawled to each other in a small patch of clearing with Japanese soldiers around them in the darkness. "Got any ideas?" asked Riley. They discussed various ways of getting back to Robinson's position, but each seemed impossible. I suppose that slight vignette tells the first, not the first contact, but the first sort of major conflict for the Australians in Milne Bay, the first death of an Australian in Milne Bay, but the decision-making at the time. This took about 1 a.m. in the middle of the night, having Japanese approach your position, really talks to the character of, I suppose, the battle in Milne Bay.
Yeah, I think as well it talks to how quickly positions can get isolated and how confusing night conflict is. And I don't know. I mean, I think MVG's helped that, but it is still, your senses are still changed by the night. Okay, so the 61st Battalion pulls back and withdraws past a place called KB Mission, which is a small village on that northern coast along the track. It's known as Government Track. The Clowes recognises that he needs to continue to blunt the Japanese force, and he assigns field, I guess what we would now term something like OPCON. He gives them one of the battalions from the veteran 18th Brigade, and that's the 2nd 10th Battalion under the command of James Dobbs. Now, That battalion has been out on a fighting patrol through the day and is heading back towards one of the airfields when they receive orders to Fields orders, 7th Brigade orders, to push forward and occupy and defend KB Mission. Why is it important that they're out on a fighting patrol? They had left all of their heavy equipment back in their camp, and they were unable to go back and get it in order to occupy KB Mission in time. That meant that they didn't have those boys' anti-tank rifles. Their only option for anti-tank weaponry was sticky bombs, which think of an old school German stick grenade, then with a big, like grapefruit plus size ball of explosive on the top of it, which had a sticky coating to stick to a tank track or similar, a tank wheel.
But they were like notoriously unreliable. Like either the adhesive would fail or the grenade would fail in its. But it took a soldier a great deal of sort of bravery to run forward with this, sticky bomb that they didn't know would sort of initiate, to put it on these tanks. That's what we're talking about now. That's your only defense against tanks, is these unreliable sticky bombs.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, they'd first been conceived, I think, as the British were looking for a way to combat German tanks in case of a German invasion of the British Isles. And obviously the climate in the UK is significantly different to the climate in Papua New Guinea. So the adhesives, as you say, had perished and degraded on them. So the sticky bombs were not so sticky. The other thing that they didn't have was ETs, entrenching tools. So they face this situation where they get down to KB Mission in fading light, and they start laying out in all-round defence, because the Japanese are renowned for their infiltration tactics, particularly through jungle. So they go into all-round defence, and they literally have no way to dig into the ground. So they're kind of using these grass huts and large palm trees as the only cover that they have, which is obviously not ideal. But I think it's worth pondering, and we might do this at the end, it's worth pondering what would we do if we needed to make on foot the sorts of timings that these men needed to do in terms of the heavy equipment that they were able to take. Now, you mentioned in your first quote about the Hargo tanks having spotlights, and that really is a key thing that Australian troops who fought at KB Mission remember. So the Japanese launch an assault on KB Mission with all of the men that they can muster, and also the 2 Hargo tanks. They start pushing into the village with the Hargo tanks, and there follows some extraordinary scenes of heroism with Australians trying to race out and put those sticky bombs onto the Japanese tanks. They're often the Australians are lit up by the tanks, and then they're using that as they're using those spotlights as a fire control method, both for the tanks themselves and also for the Japanese supporting infantry.
Yeah, it's like the tanks are advancing with their spotlights off, and then illuminating the spotlights, and both the tanks and the infantry behind them are engaging Australian forces, and then subsequently the lights go off on the tank, and then they advance forward. And then they identify Australians by illuminating the lights again and firing. Yeah,
and it gets to the point where the Australians are convinced that the Hargo tanks have this. This is what the Australians think. They have a series of mirrors to get the spotlight out of the tank. So think like an unsophisticated periscope to get the light out, because they're convinced that they are trying to shoot out the light, but it's not actually going out. Not true at all. They just weren't able to hit it for whatever reason. And but yeah, it's part of the myth of that battle, I suppose. The Japanese also, so the KB Mission is on the beach. And the Australian positions to the south are kind of overlooking the beach, but also they're drawn to the sound of battle, which is further to the east. But at a certain point, they realise that the Japanese are actually starting to flank them along the beach, crawling through along the beach. And there's this incredible story of Australians then heading down to the beach and engaging in hand-to-hand combat. And one guy in particular I want to call out, and that's Private William McLennan, who is credited with killing 5 Japanese soldiers on that beach with a bayonet. Just extraordinary bravery and endurance as well. So because of the inability of the Australians to deal with those tanks, Dobbs, who is the commanding officer, decides that he needs to pull back about 300 metres, cross a small creek line, and then establish another defensive position at that creek line and push back. But he doesn't have alternate positions. For us in modern times, we like to have alternate positions that you fall back to and a clear plan of how you would conduct a delaying defence. He hasn't had time to do that because he occupied the position so late. And once he starts the withdrawal, he finds it very difficult to then rally his troops to turn around and fight another pitched battle at the creek line. And there's also a significant amount of Australians that are left in and around KB Mission, either to become prisoners or to try to make their own way back through an escape and evasion activity up to the north. But as a result, they keep on fighting throughout the night, but it's not going well, and he's struggling to rally his veteran troops. Okay, so Dobbs makes a decision that KB Mission and the position at KB Mission is no longer viable, and his immediate plan is to pull back 200 to 300 metres to a creek line and establish another defensive position there by that creek line. The problem is that because they occupied so late in the day, he doesn't actually have alternate positions sighted on this creek line. Plus, he's got men who have just fought the Japanese and the Japanese tanks, and the result is that while he can rally pockets of men throughout the rest of that time, he's unable to get the battalion to form a coordinated defence to fight another pitched battle at the creek. So the 2nd 10th Battalion's withdrawal sort of degenerates, and they start moving in the up government track in small groups. The 25th Battalion is further up the track. This is a militia formation, and they describe it that it was this confused situation where you would get stragglers from the 2nd 10th Battalion intermixed with Japanese soldiers as well. So you get this really confusing picture. You also have the officers of the 25th Battalion trying to rally the soldiers of the 2nd 10th Battalion. And, it appears that on a few occasions the soldiers of the 2nd 10th Battalion essentially tell the officers of the 25th Militia Battalion to fuck off, which is I think important to realise that despite these being veterans of the North African campaign, brave soldiers, people have limits.
Yeah. Well, I suppose the limit is you talked about one of the diggers killing 5 people on the beach with his bayonet, and then told to move to a successive delay position that has not been sighted in the jungle, 300 metres, which would seem way further in dense terrain.
Yeah.
It's starting to sort of semi fall apart for them, I suppose, and they're like, no, fuck this.
Well, it's also the case that these are people who have watched the weaponry that they have be completely ineffective against enemy tanks, and you're now wanting those same people to turn around and go again without any new weaponry. It's a difficult thing to ask, I think, and it's worthwhile not being so clouded in your thoughts by the Anzac legend that you think that soldiers are just going to continue to respond in the absence of hope. Okay, so there is another battle that the 25th fights, but essentially we're getting now quite close to the first of the airfields, which is number 3 airstrip, and there's a few clearings around that. There's a number of other battles. It might be worth just zooming out for a second and looking at what's going on from a high command perspective, because Clowes is under enormous pressure.
Again, the 2-star in charge of, yep.
Correct, sorry. The 2-star Cyril Clowes, he's under enormous pressure from General Blamey and also American General Douglas MacArthur, who are wanting a highly aggressive response to this Japanese force, and think that he should simply send all of his forces to go and quickly destroy. Now, there's a few problems with that. The first one is that Clowes has the uncertainty to deal with of, are there going to be additional landings? Is there going to be a landing on the southern coast of the bay in which I need to save something in reserve for that? But perhaps the bigger problem is that you can't just send 7,500 men down a muddy track. It doesn't work logistically. It doesn't work. So, yeah, Clowes is constantly fighting this battle. Now, interestingly, another of his Duntroon classmates is a guy called General Rowell. Now, General Rowell is back in Port Moresby in command of PNG in general, and he very much has Clowes' back. But again, another guy who's known two of those people on the ground for 30 years. And then back in General Headquarters is back in Brisbane is General Vasey, who some of you may have heard of. One of our more celebrated generals from the Second World War in particular. But Vasey went to Duntroon in 1913, so he's actually the junior class of Rowell, Wootton and Clowes. So they all know each other from back in those days. But again, the class, that first Duntroon class was 32 people. These guys know each other and their strengths and weaknesses very
to
well,
a certain degree. Vasey is right up, like asking for blow by blow accounts of the battle and how it's unfolding. Like the pressure that each of the generals in PNG is under is immense in terms of reporting back constantly and consistently to make sort of a play by play for the generals back in Brisbane.
Yeah, absolutely. Vasey is very much on, I guess, the side of Clowes and Rowell in pushing back against Blamey and MacArthur, but he doesn't feel as though he's getting the ammunition to be able to push back. So I'll quote from actually a letter that Vasey sent to Rowell. He says, "I'm dying to go to these bastards," and by these bastards he's talking about Blamey and MacArthur, and say, "I told you so. We've killed the bloody lot." And then he says, "I've just had a brainwave, which might help with GHQ, General Headquarters. It is that your sit-reps be worded in the most offensive manner. For example, a sit-rep went from Cyril, as in Cyril Clowes, has just been picked up, and in it he says he's recaptured the mission. Why recapture? Why not say our troops stormed and captured the mission, killing XXX Japs?" And then he goes on to say, no need to mention our own casualties unless they're operationally significant. So I think, like, even here you see the desire for positive news, the desire for spin, and Vasey terms it. He says, "Don't think me mad, but this is a war of nerves." He's talking about their trying to manage up effectively, which I think is something that we all do perhaps too intuitively now. Now the 25th Battalion then fights their own battle against the Japanese, which again results in a withdrawal that has the potential to degenerate into a rout. But this is one for all of the warrant officers out there. There's an RSM called Warrant Officer Barnett, who decides that he's going to stop the rout, and brandishing two revolvers, he's heard to say, "I'll shoot the first fella that bloody well takes another step." And none of them want to call his bluff on that. And so they turn and fight. And there is a series of encounter battles after that moment, and they culminate with a pitched battle for Airfield Number 3, which I think as you read it, you can see that it was never going to go the Japanese way. One, because of their tactics, which was up the guts with lots of smoke.
Single track, like advancing up a single track, basically.
And then onto an airfield, and the airfield provided a large field of fire for two dug-in battalions on the other side of the airstrip, supported by US engineers that had tracked vehicles with 30 cals and 50 cals, and they had mortars, and they also had 25-pounder artillery that could concentrate on that one track onto the airfield. And the Japanese were indeed slaughtered in a way that becomes unfortunately quite common for Japanese, showing suicidal bravery throughout the war. Now, after that battle, there follows about a week of mopping up operations, and I'm certainly not saying that they weren't important. However, we won't go into detail because the decision about the Battle of Milne Bay was reached at that airfield that night, and probably even before it, I would suggest. So perhaps we leave the detail there, and we start to talk about
the analysis,
some of our takeaways.
I suppose we did provide some analysis throughout, but that was the description of the battle. I suppose, what are the takeaways from the Battle of Milne Bay, the turning point in the Pacific? What are your sort of key takeaways, sir?
Okay, so let's trade takeaways, Todd. So my first takeaway is that, and I've mentioned this before, that the political imperative to take action at a certain place and at a certain time will trump the capabilities that you have and the trained people that you have. We had to go to Milne Bay with whatever it was that we had. Now, as it turned out, that was enough. But for instance, we didn't take light tanks to Milne Bay because we didn't have them at the time. A couple of Stuart tanks, for instance, could have been highly useful against those Hargo tanks. So that's sort of my first takeaway. What about you? Have you got any?
I suppose mine's the on the flip side. This is an army podcast, but I'm going to drill into the RAF. So I've obviously got RAF trainees, and they keep saying that we'll always sleep in hotels and we'll never have to go to field and stuff. And my argument against that is Milne Bay, 75 and 76 Squadron. We just spoke about them before, but flying Kitty Hawks into a aircraft matting, it was covered in mud. The aircraft, as they landed, would just get absolutely underside, covered in mud, and there would be maintainers and aircrew trying to scrape this mud off with their bare hands. The pilots are sleeping and defending an airfield in the mud with the rest of this sort of the army there. And I think most of the army got a really good appreciation of the RAF in that they used to, I suppose there was those stereotypes of like the RAF go back and sleep in, clean sheets and, they've always got their hair done and stuff. That was not the case at Milne Bay. They were fighting hard. And some of the pilots were flying with dysentery and malaria in jocks and literally with explosive diarrhea and vomiting in the aircraft as they're flying these aircraft in formation for the potentially somewhat the first time, or inexperienced pilots trying to land these sort of have an effect on the Japanese. I think that's an awesome takeaway for not so much the Army listeners, but the RAF listeners, I suppose, as well, sir.
Oh, I'm thrilled to hear that we have Air Force listeners. I agree with you, mate. The performance of those Kitty Hawks was pivotal to that battle. Okay, another takeaway. Battles can be won at the theatre and operational level. I think it's very hard to conceive of a set of circumstances at Milne Bay where the landing of, say, 2,500 Japanese soldiers was going to be able to overcome 2 brigades, 7,500 worth of Australian troops. And those preconditions were set by things that were happening at theatre and operational level. So, the tactical battle can be won at the operational level is one of my points. Okay, another one of mine is I think the second tenth's decision to, on that fighting patrol, go lightly is something that we're currently missing. We currently are a very heavy force, and I mean that both in terms of our vehicles, but also just what we expect an individual soldier to walk around and patrol in. And I think that while we want to be wearing body armour and helmets and everything else and be as protected as possible, it's also possible that a tactical mission within the tropics might require walking somewhere in a time frame that is unable to be done with body armour on and the like.
Yeah.
So I think we need to be thinking about what we look like and what the endurance implications are of what we're travelling with.
Yeah, and those trade-offs, I suppose, with not just the personal equipment, but anti-tank. Like, what task are we going? What can be retasked for? It's like I think we'll just carry everything, and we'll be fully equipped with body armor, combat helmets, and everything we can carry. But that's not the realities of what we're talking about in high altitude Pacific jungle locations where the rate of movement is slow and it's hard slog.
Yeah, and I guess you end up needing to balance how many non-battle casualties am I going to take on these jungle tracks wearing all of this equipment versus how prepared am I going to be for the fight that I might get into. I don't know. That's one for the infanteers in particular to be contemplating, though, I'd suggest. Optimism bias, I think, is another takeaway. It's a real thing. The Japanese, because of the success of the Japanese thrust against much greater odds in terms of the amount of Japanese soldiers, say at Singapore or versus the amount of Allied ones, they thought that they were Invincible's too strong, but they thought that they could take on odds that should have been daunting.
I suppose culminated in that attack on the number 3 airfield, like one track, single track, with some flanking forces, but basically everyone straight up one track.
Yeah, absolutely. They thought that their morale would see them through, and morale in the face of steel doesn't always work. And then optimism bias as well, I think, for MacArthur and Blamey, where pushing Clowes to conduct decisive action, which might have resulted in victory, but also could have resulted in vulnerability if the Japanese had decided to send an additional force. I think that there is a takeaway here about the nature of domains, and you see that the land domain is persistent. Army and land force, they're persistent, whereas both maritime and also air is it's temporal. So, for instance, the Japanese owned the bay by night by dint of the fact that they could get destroyers and light cruisers in to resupply their force for those few days that they needed to. But they also were scared of the RAAF aircraft by day. So I think that that just highlights the differences in the domains that we need to be conscious of. And my last takeaway is don't be a dickhead, and particularly don't be a dickhead to your peers, because you cannot predict how important a personal relationship that you form at a place like Duntroon or at an early battalion that you're serving at, wherever it might be, might play out in 20 years' time when you're a general trying to defend against an assault on your position by a motivated enemy.
That's absolutely awesome, sir. I think it definitely ended more positively, and that there was a more positive, I suppose, episode than the last that we've covered. Thank you so much for, I suppose, going through. We couldn't cover everything, and obviously some historians out there will be like, "Oh, you missed the detail in the attack on the number 3 airfield and the like." But basically, I think that's some awesome key takeaways to take from Milne Bay and the Battle of Milne Bay. Again, we've given you some resources and put them in the show notes so that you can continue to read the story. But an absolutely awesome account. Thanks, sir.
No, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Cove Podcast. Explore our channel for more great audio PME content. Also, visit us at cove.army.gov.au for hundreds of additional resources. The Cove, the learning home of the Australian profession of arms.